1 year ago, Caitlin Clark was sitting on a bench in street clothes, watching her teammates fight through the playoffs without her. She had a clipboard in her hands instead of a basketball, and a season that was supposed to be her coronation had quietly fallen apart. 12 months later, she is standing toe-to-toe with a 4-time Most Valuable Player, and people who had written her off are now arguing, out loud, that she might win the most important individual award in the league. So how did she get from that bench back into the center of everything? How did she rebuild her body and her confidence after a season that played out almost entirely in a training room? Why did the Indiana Fever stumble out of the gate this spring before suddenly catching fire? And can a former Rookie of the Year really chase down a champion who has already won this award 4 times? Stick with me, because this is the full story of Caitlin Clark's comeback, and it is a better story than even her fans expected. To understand why the last year hurt so much, you have to go back to where she started, because the fall only matters if you remember how high she was flying. Rewind to the spring of 2024. Caitlin Clark walks out of the University of Iowa as the most famous women's college basketball player anyone had ever seen. She leaves as the all-time leading scorer in NCAA Division I history, men or women, a record nobody saw coming when she arrived in Iowa City as a skinny guard with limitless range. The Indiana Fever take her with the #1 overall pick in the 2024 draft, and the expectations on her shoulders are almost unfair. People are not asking her to be a good rookie. They are asking her to change the entire sport. And then she does exactly that. In her first professional season, Clark led the entire league in assists, averaging 8.4 a night. Think about how rare that is. A rookie guard, learning a new league, getting knocked around by veterans every single game, and she finished first in the whole league at setting up her teammates. She scored 19.2 points a night on top of that. She set the single-season assist record. She was named to the All-WNBA First Team, which is reserved for the best handful of players in the world. And when the votes came in for Rookie of the Year, it was not close. She won 66 of 67 votes. One lonely ballot went somewhere else, and to this day nobody is entirely sure why. She even finished 4th in the Most Valuable Player voting that year. Let that sink in for a second. A first-year player, in her very first season, finished 4th for the biggest award in the league, ahead of dozens of established veterans who had been doing this for years. Now, here is the part the highlight reels do not always show you. She did all of that while getting treated like a target. Veterans did not roll out the welcome mat for the most hyped rookie in league history. She absorbed hard fouls. She took shots to the body. She heard plenty of words that were not friendly. There was a sense around the league that she had to earn her place the hard way, and she did, night after night, often picking herself up off the floor to do it. Off the court, something even bigger was happening. They started calling it the Caitlin Clark effect, and it was not an exaggeration. Arenas that had never sold out a women's basketball game were suddenly turning fans away at the door. Cities added games to bigger buildings just to fit the demand. Television numbers climbed to levels the league had not seen in decades. Her jersey became one of the best-selling items in the entire league. For a sport that had spent years fighting for attention, Caitlin Clark was a one-woman tidal wave, and the whole league was riding it. So when the calendar turned to 2025, the story almost seemed to write itself. Everybody expected the same thing, only better. A second-year leap. A deeper playoff run. Maybe a real run at that MVP trophy she had finished 4th for as a rookie. The hype was not just back. It was louder than ever. And that is exactly why what happened next was so hard to watch. The 2025 season did not fall apart in one dramatic moment. There was no terrible collision, no slow-motion replay that the whole internet shared the next morning. It was quieter than that, and in some ways that made it worse. It started with one injury, then a second one. Then it became a pattern that no amount of rest seemed to fix. A strain here. A setback in recovery there. Each one chipped away at a few more weeks of a season that was supposed to belong to her. The reports kept rolling in through the summer. Lower body injuries. A bone bruise. A groin strain that finally shut her down for good. According to reporting from ESPN and others who followed the team closely, her last game of the season came on July 15, 2025, when she strained her groin one more time. By the time it was over, Caitlin Clark had played in just 13 games the entire year. Think about that number for a moment. A season that stretches across many months, dozens of games, and she was healthy enough to play in a number you could count before you finished your morning coffee. In early September, she announced on her own social media that she would not return for the rest of the season. The comeback everyone kept waiting for simply never arrived. Now here is the strange part, the part that made her situation even more complicated. The Indiana Fever did not collapse without her. They finished the regular season with 24 wins and 20 losses. That was good enough for the 6th seed in the playoffs. And then they did something nobody expected from a team missing its biggest star. They went on the road and upset the 3rd-seeded Atlanta Dream in the first round. A team that had lost its franchise player for most of the year was advancing in the playoffs anyway. They eventually ran into the Las Vegas Aces in the second round, and that is where the run ended. The Fever pushed the Aces to a 5th and deciding game, and that game went all the way to overtime before Las Vegas finally pulled away. The Aces went on to win the championship that year, their 3rd title in 4 seasons. Indiana went home, having proven they were tough and deep and well coached, all while their best player watched from the sideline. And that raised an uncomfortable question that followed Clark all winter. If the team could win without her, what exactly was her value when she came back? It was a cruel way to frame it, but you could hear people asking it. The deeper the Fever went in those playoffs, the louder that question got. The noise around her did not pause to be polite about any of it. Analysts started openly wondering whether the league might just go back to looking the way it did before she arrived. Oddsmakers who had once treated her like a lock for major awards quietly moved their attention to other names. And the most uncomfortable question in the whole sport became this. Was 2024 a glimpse of a once-in-a-generation talent, or was it a flash that burned too bright to last? Was she a player whose own body would never let her repeat that perfect first season? What made it even heavier was everything she was carrying while she sat there. This was not just a young athlete recovering from injury. She had become the face of an entire movement. Every empty box score now carried the weight of a league that had grown enormously on the back of her popularity. The attention did not go away while she was hurt. If anything, it grew louder, because every game she missed was a reminder of how much the sport had come to lean on one 23-year-old's health. That is a tremendous amount of pressure to carry while your own body refuses to cooperate. Clark later reflected on that stretch in a way that told you a lot about her. She said the time away taught her she could still contribute even when she was not on the floor, and that she got to be, in her words, her teammates' biggest fan from the bench. For someone used to being the center of everything, learning to lead from the sidelines was its own kind of education. But make no mistake, this was the heartbreak the whole comeback story begins with. Not a single bad night. Not a buzzer-beating loss. A full season reduced to 13 games, a roster that learned to win without her, and a growing chorus of people wondering if she had already hit her ceiling before she even turned 23. The question now was simple, and it was the oldest question in sports. When an athlete gets knocked down this hard, do they fade away, or do they come back stronger? Caitlin Clark spent the next several months answering that question, and she did it where almost nobody could see. Here is something true about heartbreak in sports. It either ends an athlete, or it rebuilds them. There is rarely an in-between. And the way an athlete chooses to spend their darkest off-season usually tells you which one is coming. Caitlin Clark spent hers in the quietest way imaginable. There were no viral training videos packaged for social media. There were no countdown clocks ticking toward a dramatic return. There was no carefully staged comeback narrative being sold to anyone. According to a detailed feature ESPN published this spring on her recovery, most of her rehab happened in Indianapolis, where she could lean on familiar facilities, familiar trainers, and the medical staff she already trusted. It was the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a body that had broken down in pieces. She did not do it alone. In that same ESPN feature, Clark singled out the Fever's head athletic trainer, Maria Witt, for the long hours she put in, calling her the most selfless person. That is the kind of detail that does not make a highlight reel, but it is exactly the kind of relationship that gets an athlete back on the floor. Eventually, she was cleared for pickup games, and that created a funny problem. You cannot just post an open invitation for anyone in the city to come play against the most famous women's basketball player in the world. So the people around her got to work finding the right competition. Her boyfriend, Connor McCaffrey, a former Iowa player who had been coaching in college, did some recruiting. A FIBA player development coach pitched in too. Little by little, in gyms that nobody was filming, Caitlin Clark started playing real basketball again. The first time the rest of the world got to see the results, it was not in a FIBA uniform at all. It was in a USA basketball jersey, in March of 2026, at a FIBA World Cup qualifying tournament in San Juan, Puerto Rico, played inside an arena the locals call El Coli. It was a smaller stage than a championship series, far from a usual spotlight, but it mattered far more than its size suggested. She came off the bench in her very first game on March 11th, against Senegal, and put up 17 points and 12 assists. A double-double, in about 20 minutes, in her first competitive game in roughly 8 months. By the reckoning of the reporters who tracked it, it was her first real game in 239 days. 239 days. And she walked in off the bench and looked like herself. It only got better from there. Team USA rolled through the tournament with a perfect 5-0 record. In the final game, an 84-70 win over a tough Spain team, Clark put up 7 points and 7 assists in just over 22 minutes. When it was all over, FIBA named her the tournament's most valuable player. For the week, she averaged 11.6 points and a tournament-best 6.4 assists, while shooting nearly 53% from the field and 40% from behind the three-point line. They put her on the All-Star 5 for the event. And here is a detail that tells you this was not a fluke. It was the second time in her life she had been named MVP of a FIBA tournament, the first coming years earlier as a teenager. Why did one tournament in March carry so much weight? Because it answered the only question that actually mattered. Not whether she could still play. Plenty of people can play after an injury. The question was whether she could still dominate. The hype around Caitlin Clark had always lived or died on dominance, not just participation. A healthy version of her who simply showed up was never going to be enough for a fan base that had watched her redefine what a rookie season could look like. San Juan answered that question before the WNBA season had even tipped off. 2 other things happened around the same time that quietly worked in her favor. First, USA Basketball confirmed she would be part of the picture heading toward the World Cup in Berlin that September, which meant the doubts about her health were fading at the highest level of the sport. And second, off the court, the league itself reached a landmark moment. The WNBA and its Players Association agreed to a historic new collective bargaining agreement after a long and tense negotiation. That removed a giant cloud of uncertainty that had been hanging over the entire upcoming season. Players who might have considered sitting out, or playing overseas instead, suddenly had every reason to commit fully. For a sport trying to capitalize on the momentum Clark herself had helped create, the timing could not have been better. A healthier league needed a healthy version of its biggest draw, and it was about to get one. By the time the off-season wound down, the betting markets had already rendered their verdict. Sportsbooks like BetMGM installed Caitlin Clark as the favorite to win the league's Most Valuable Player award for the coming season. Not just a contender. The favorite, at around plus 225. The reigning 4-time winner of the award was listed right behind her, separated by only a handful of points. Stop and think about how absurd that would have sounded 12 months earlier, when she was sitting on a bench in street clothes. Now it was simply where the numbers landed, built on nothing more dramatic than one strong summer tournament and a body that finally felt whole again. The rebuild was not loud. It did not need to be. There is a reason real comeback stories tend to follow this same quiet pattern. The dramatic version, the one with countdown clocks and produced montages, almost never produces the athlete who actually returns better than before. The version that works is the boring one, the one nobody gets to film, where a player simply puts in the same repetitive work day after day until the doubt on the outside stops mattering, because the certainty on the inside has already come back. That is the version Caitlin Clark chose. And it showed the moment she stepped back onto a WNBA floor. It just did not show in the way anyone expected. A healthy return does not erase a year of doubt overnight. And the start of the 2026 season made that painfully clear, almost immediately. The trouble actually started before the regular season even began. During preseason, Clark suffered a quad injury that cost her some of those warm-up games. In the 3 preseason games she did play, she was eased back in carefully, averaging around 13 points in just 15 minutes a night. The team was being cautious, which was the smart thing to do, but it also meant she was still knocking off rust when the games started to count. The Fever opened their regular season in early May against the Dallas Wings, and the basketball world could not have scripted a better storyline. On the other side was Paige Bueckers, the previous year's #1 overall pick and the reigning Rookie of the Year. Two of the most celebrated young guards the sport had ever produced, lining up against each other in the very first week. Every eye in the building was searching for proof that the player who dominated as a rookie was truly back. What they got instead was Messier. They got a team finding its footing. The Fever had made big additions in the off-season, and those new pieces were still learning how to play alongside their star. One new teammate, the veteran forward Myisha Hines-Allen, had spoken in the off-season about how much it meant to come play with Clark, describing her as one of the greatest players who will ever play the game. The talent was clearly there on paper. But talent on paper and chemistry on the floor are two very different things, and early on, Indiana looked like a group still figuring each other out. They stumbled to a record of 5 wins and 5 losses. Now, 5-5 is not a collapse. It is not a disaster. But it was just enough stumbling to reopen every old question the off-season hype had supposedly put to bed. Was she still the same player? Was this supporting cast actually built to support her? Could a roster with this much turnover come together quickly enough to matter before the season slipped away? The criticism arrived fast, and it did not stay polite. Even respected voices from outside the league weighed in. At one point, an NBA Hall of Famer publicly challenged Clark to grow into more of a vocal leader on the floor, not just a scorer and a passer, but someone who directs and demands. When a legend of that stature feels the need to call you out publicly, right in the middle of a shaky 5-5 stretch, it tells you just how closely the entire basketball world is still watching every single move you make. Here is the uncomfortable truth about being Caitlin Clark. There is no quiet path back for her. There is no slow ramp-up period where the mistakes get forgiven. A typical player returning from a lost season gets a grace period. She does not get one. Every shooting slump becomes a headline. Every assist total gets compared, in real time, against a 4-time most valuable player on the other side of the country. Her field goal percentage, which had been a topic of conversation since her rookie year, turned into its own running storyline. Was it good enough? Was it climbing fast enough to support a real championship push? Or was it just one more statistic for the doubters to point at? And yet, buried underneath that 5-5 record and all the outside noise, something else was happening that the headlines were not capturing. Her assist numbers were elite from the very first week back. Her turnovers, which had been a fair criticism dating all the way back to her rookie season, were trending toward a career low. Read that again because it matters. A career low in turnovers. She was not playing like someone still searching for her legs after a lost year. She was playing like someone who had simply landed on a team that was still finding its own identity around her. That is a subtle distinction, but it is an enormous one, and most of the early commentary missed it completely. That distinction mattered more than the record did. A player in genuine decline does not quietly post some of the most efficient numbers of her career while her team works out its chemistry. A player in decline does not lead the league's weekly conversation every single time she takes the floor. The doubters had a record to point to, and a fair one at that. What they did not have, not yet, was any actual evidence that the player herself had gotten worse. They were about to find out just how wrong that doubt was. Real basketball turnarounds rarely arrive with a single dramatic announcement. They do not usually happen because of one perfect game. They happen the way most important things happen, quietly, game by game, possession by possession, until one day the results are simply impossible to argue with. Somewhere around the midpoint of the season, the 5-5 Indiana Fever quietly became a completely different team. It started subtly. A close win here. A more comfortable one there. And then the wins started to stack up, until the streak reached 4 in a row. The signature performance of that run came against the Toronto Tempo, one of the league's brand new expansion teams, and it was not close. Indiana won by a final score of 113-91. It was, by a wide margin, the most dominant win the Fever had produced all season, and Caitlin Clark was right at the center of it. But here is what made that night so revealing, and it is the heart of this whole story. Her shot was not falling. She finished that game shooting just 5 of 15 from the field, and only 1 of 8 from three-point range. On paper, that looks like a quiet, forgettable night for a star player. On the court, it was anything but. Because while her own shot was not working, she finished with 21 points, 5 rebounds, and 14 assists. 14. When she could not score the way she usually does, she did not force it. She did not chase her own numbers at the expense of the team. She simply found everyone else, over and over again, until the game was no longer competitive. And is that not the entire argument for why she belongs in the most valuable player conversation in the first place? Not just big scoring nights when her jumper is falling, but the ability to completely control the outcome of a game even on a night when her shooting says she should not have been able to. That is the difference between a great scorer and a great player. Her teammates rewarded that trust immediately. One veteran guard, Kelsey Mitchell, went off for 27 points of her own that night. Another teammate, Sophie Cunningham, caught fire from outside, knocking down 6 three-pointers on her way to 24 points. 3 different Fever players reached double figures in scoring. This was not a one-woman show propping up a struggling roster anymore. This was a team finally clicking into the version of itself that everyone had imagined back in the preseason, before the slow start made people forget how talented this group actually was. That performance also put Clark in some rare historical company. With that 21-point, 14-assist night, she became just the second player in the entire history of the league to record multiple games with at least 20 points and 14 assists. The only other name on that list is Diana Taurasi, one of the greatest players the sport has ever known. When your off-shooting night lands your name next to Diana Taurasi in the record book, the conversation about whether you have declined is essentially over. The win pushed Indiana's record to 9 wins and 5 losses. That was a complete reversal of the uncertainty that had surrounded the franchise just a few weeks earlier. And more importantly than the record, it quietly answered the leadership question that had followed Clark since the very first week of the season. Remember that Hall of Famer who challenged her to lead more? Well, a point guard who simply scores does not generate this kind of team-wide confidence on a night when her own shot abandons her. A point guard who lifts everyone around her, even when she cannot buy a basket, does exactly that. The answer to the leadership question was sitting right there in the box score. The reaction across the basketball world was immediate and pointed. It was the kind of moment where commentators stop hedging their predictions and start saying out loud what they had only been hinting at for weeks. One headline summed up the mood perfectly, declaring her the 2026 MVP and telling everyone to book it. The conversation shifted almost overnight, from whether Caitlin Clark could still be an elite player, to whether she might already be playing her way toward the league's biggest individual prize. And all of it came exactly 1 year removed from a season that had ended in near silence. The timing of that streak mattered just as much as the wins themselves. This was not a meaningless run buried in the middle of a lost season. It landed at the exact moment when the betting markets, the media panels, and the fans filling out their all-star ballots were all forming their first real impressions of how this season was going to unfold. A 4-game stretch is a small sample in a long season. But in a league where perception moves fast and narratives harden even faster, it was more than enough to flip the entire conversation in her favor. Which brings us, finally, to the race that everyone is arguing about right now. So where does that leave the most valuable player race today? Closer than almost anyone predicted 12 months ago, and far from decided, with months of basketball still left to play. To understand the mountain Caitlin Clark is trying to climb, you have to understand the person standing at the top of it. Her name is Aya Wilson, and she may be the best basketball player on the planet. Wilson plays center for the Las Vegas Aces, and her resume is staggering. In 2025, she won the Most Valuable Player award for the 4th time in her career, becoming the first player in the history of the league to do it 4 times. She broke a tie with 3 legends of the game who had each won it 3 times. She is the reigning champion, having led the Aces to their 3rd title in 4 years. In that same 2025 season, she also won the Finals MVP and shared the Defensive Player of the Year award, making her one of the only players ever to dominate on both ends of the floor at that level in a single year. Her coach, Becky Hammon, once described her greatness by saying simply, "You are the only one. You're Everest." And here is the scary part for everyone chasing her. She is not slowing down. This season she has actually raised her scoring, averaging right around 25 points a night and leading the entire league, which is up from her numbers the year before. Her case for the award requires almost no explanation. She is simply meeting the extraordinary standard she has already set, year after year after year. When you are chasing Aya Wilson, you are not chasing a hot streak. You are chasing a decade of proven greatness. So what exactly is Caitlin Clark's case against a resume like that? It is a complete one. As of this point in the season, Clark sits among the league leaders in scoring, at right around 20 to 21 points a night. She is second in the entire league in assists, at close to 8 per game. She ranks third on her own team in rebounding. She is among her team's leaders in both steals and blocks. That is a full, two-way statistical profile, not a single eye-popping number. Her shooting percentage, which was a genuine concern early in the year, has climbed steadily back toward her record-setting rookie levels. And her turnovers, as we talked about, are sitting at a career low. Is that not exactly the kind of season a most valuable player case is built on? Not one overwhelming category, but a complete contribution to a team that transformed itself across one season, from a shaky 5-5 start into one of the most dangerous rosters in the league. The argument for Clark is not just what she does. It is what her team became once she found her rhythm. The league itself has noticed. In one recent week, both Caitlin Clark and Aya Wilson were named their conference's Player of the Week on the very same day, a kind of split-screen preview of the race to come. The two names keep getting mentioned in the same breath, and that alone is a victory for a player who, 1 year ago, was being left out of the conversation entirely. Now, I owe you some honesty here, because a good story does not need to oversimplify the facts. This is not a clean two-person race, no matter how much the matchup with Wilson captures the imagination. There is a third name you need to know, and it is the very player Clark faced on opening night. Paige Bueckers, the young star in Dallas, is having an excellent season of her own, and as the calendar turned towards summer, several sportsbooks actually had Clark sitting third in the MVP odds, behind both Wilson and Bueckers. There are even rookies, like Minnesota's Olivia Miles, forcing their way into the edges of the conversation. The league is overflowing with talent right now, and that is partly Clark's own doing, because she is a big reason so many fans are watching in the first place. But here is where you can see just how far the public perception has swung back in her favor. When the league released its second round of All-Star fan voting in late June, Caitlin Clark sat second overall in the entire league, with more than 670,000 votes. The only player ahead of her was her own teammate, Aaliyah Boston. Clark was actually ahead of Aya Wilson in the fan voting. And that number is even more striking when you know that in the very first round of voting, Clark had been all the way down in 5th place. In a matter of weeks, she surged past nearly everyone. That is not the fan support of a fading star. That is the fan support of someone the public has decided to rally behind. All of that energy is building toward a single night. The All-Star Game this year is set for July 25th at the United Center in Chicago, part of the league's celebration of its 30th season. It is going to be a packed house in a basketball-mad city, and Caitlin Clark is going to be one of the brightest names on the floor in the same season she was supposed to be fighting just to prove she still belonged. Here is the part worth saying clearly, though. Nobody has won anything yet. The award is not decided by betting odds in the middle of June. It is not decided by one 4-game winning streak. It gets decided in the final weeks of the season, when every statistic and every team result gets weighed against a 4-time champion who has made a career out of closing seasons exactly when it matters most. Aya Wilson has a habit of getting stronger as the year goes on, and that should worry everyone chasing her. There is one more layer to all of this that makes it genuinely fascinating. The Most Valuable Player award is not decided by one group of people. The voting splits between the fans, the players themselves, and a panel of media members, and each of those groups tends to value different things. A 4-time champion like Wilson holds a built-in edge with voters who reward proven, sustained greatness. A comeback story like Clark's holds a built-in edge with voters who are drawn to narrative and to a team that transformed itself. That tension is exactly why this race feels less like a coronation and more like a real argument, one that could honestly go either way, all the way to the final week of the season. But just when the story seemed to be settling into a clean 2-horse race, the season threw one more curveball. Because here is the thing about Caitlin Clark's last 12 months. The one variable that has never fully gone away is her health. And in late June, It showed up again. In a game against the Phoenix Mercury on June 24th, a tight contest that Indiana eventually lost by a final score of 111 to 109, Clark left the floor in the third quarter with a back issue and did not return. That alone was enough to send a nervous jolt through Fever fans who had spent a year watching her fight her way back from one injury after another. It got more heated than that, though. Earlier in that same game, there was an incident that drew real scrutiny. According to multiple reports, Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas pushed down on Clark's neck with her fist while the two were competing for a loose ball. The league reviewed it and reportedly suspended Thomas over the incident. It was a reminder that the physical treatment Clark has dealt with since her rookie year has not entirely gone away, even now that she is a star the whole league is built around. Clark ended up sitting out the Fever's next game, a matchup with the Los Angeles Sparks on June 27th. By the team's own account, it was only the second game she had missed all season, which, after everything she went through in 2025, is its own quiet kind of victory. As of late June, the Fever were sitting at around 10 wins and 8 losses, hovering in the thick of the Eastern Conference playoff picture, and leaning heavily on the chemistry they had built during that mid-season hot streak. I bring this up not to end the story on a worry, but because it is the honest truth of where things stand right now. This comeback is real. The numbers are real, the wins are real, and the MVP conversation is completely deserved. But the season is not finished, and the one question that has hovered over Caitlin Clark for a year now still hovers, just a little quieter than before. Can her body hold up over the long grind of a full season and a playoff run? Nobody knows yet. That is what makes the next 2 months so compelling. So that is the whole arc in one breath. 13 silent games and a season spent in street clothes. A comeback that nobody filmed, built in quiet gyms in Indianapolis. A surprise tournament MVP in Puerto Rico that put her name back on the map. A shaky 5-5 start that almost buried the story before it began. And then a 4-game streak that turned all that doubt into a real legitimate run at the most important award in the sport. 12 months ago, Caitlin Clark was watching the playoffs from a bench. Today, she is standing toe-to-toe with a 4-time champion, with months of basketball still left to decide who actually takes the trophy home. So now I want to hear from you. If you think this comeback deserves to finish with the MVP award in her hands, let me know down in the comments. And here is the real debate. Clark or Wilson? Who is your most valuable player this season? Tell me who you've got and why. If you enjoyed this one, do me a favor and hit that like button, and make sure you subscribe, because next time we are breaking down the one trade that could swing this entire MVP race. I'll see you in that one.